Hi folks, welcome to RJ Impact. Today we're going to be talking about week 12 in the Holmes Theranos trial. You can search this channel for previous week's updates and also for a more detailed video on the background to Theranos and Holmes' journey to the point at which this trial commenced. Please don't forget to like this video if you do, and subscribe to the channel, and also hit the notification button so that you don't miss out on any future videos. And as a reminder, Elizabeth Holmes is in court accused of multiple instances of fraud against doctors, patients and investors in connection with her role as CEO of Theranos, and this is week 12 of that trial.
This is what happens when you work to change things, and first they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world.
Well, according to the prosecution, this is going to be the last week that they call witnesses. If this is the case, then there will be a lot of high-profile witnesses that won't be called. After all, the number of witnesses in the original list was over 180. Let's see what the week brings. Before we talk about this week's witness testimony and goings-on at the trial, we'll take a little diversion with the background section. Background bonus. In the first week of the trial, there was a man who took his place in the spectator seats alongside the journalists and public. He was very eager to strike up conversations with anyone who would listen. And apparently his name was Hanson, and he was very supportive of Holmes, defending her to anyone else who would listen. He said that the news media, in quotes, chronically mistreated the Theranos founder, and that he was just a concerned citizen who'd always wanted to attend a trial. Wearing a Patagonia puffer jacket and a baseball cap, he mingled with the public easily. However, something wasn't quite right. A couple of people noticed that his shoes were Salvatore Ferragamo loafers, which didn't quite fit with the rest of his casual wear. Oh, and also on his coffee cup were the words Bill or Billy, and not Hanson. A man also turned up at court about a week later wearing very different clothes, no casual wear but a suit. And this man seemed very familiar. However, this man was none other than Bill Evans, father of Billy Evans, Holmes' partner. The journalist worked out why he was so familiar. He was actually Hanson from the previous week. When asked about his original disguise, he was somewhat evasive. Journalists asked whether he was a mole, and he later said that people have nicknames and you can be free to use them. What he was trying to get from the masquerade is anybody's guess. Make of it what you will. The next couple of pieces of background bonus actually relate to this week's trial. The first is in relation to last week's witness Alan Eisenman, who we'll hear from again as he testified on Monday. And as you remember, the court was adjourned from Wednesday in the 11th week to Monday on the 12th week. So Eisenman decided to go home to Texas for the interval. He'd been told when he left by the prosecutors that he should not discuss the trial with anyone, including the prosecution. So what does Eisenman do? Well, wouldn't you know it, on Thursday he decided to send an email to the prosecution reflecting on his testimony and requesting feedback and guidance. Immediately, a government agent called him, admonished him, and reiterated that he was not to contact the government and that they could not communicate with him. So what did Eisenman do? Well, the very next day, he decides to email them again. Honestly, you could not make this up. The US Attorney, John Bostic, himself then replied to Eisenman, "We, i.e. the prosecution, could not have any communication." Apparently Eisenman later said that his second email was in relation to travel back to California. However, I'm personally lost for words on this. What on earth is all I could think of. The second item was a bit of pre-jury discussion about the database where the system data relating to the Theranos blood tests were kept. Now, as we've already heard, this was lost, and the defence wants to make the point that the prosecution can't prove how many tests were successful or failed, and so can't prove its case in this respect. Now, the prosecution in turn say that if it's raised as an issue, then they will make the counterpoint that it was destroyed intentionally to thwart any prosecution. It's still unclear whether this will make its way in front of the jury. And so to the trial. Alan Eisenman. Yes, the very same one we've just talked about. And remember, he was an early investor in Theranos who was questioned last Wednesday and had made a $100,000 investment in 2013, which forms one of the wire transfer counts mentioned in the indictment. Eisenman said how he was dissatisfied with how he was treated by Theranos and the fact that he couldn't get information from Holmes and or Balwani. Now, the defence showed emails to him where Holmes and Balwani had responded to his requests for information. You can see how this escalated matters in court when Eisenman commented on some of these. "That's ridiculous. That's a lie. He responded fictitiously," Eisenman said. Downey for the defence asked him if he understood that Holmes wasn't allowed to share internal information while they were fundraising. "No, I understood that she was hiding information," Eisenman said. This was an unusual fence between management and shareholders for an extended period of time, he said, although this latter comment was actually struck from the record. He had opted not to take up Miss Holmes on an offer to buy out his stake at 5 times what he put in, according to court documents, and received a separate offer from Chris Boyes, the son of David Boyes, for $15 a share. If he'd have accepted that offer, this would have given Mr. Eisenman a profit of around $25+ million. Eisenman responded, this was a false offer. Anyway, when he didn't get the information he wanted, he sidestepped Holmes and went to Donald Lucas, who was that time chair of the board. He wasn't happy with this interaction either. Apparently Lucas EA had said to Eisenman in an email that Lucas wouldn't have the information and perhaps he should instead read the news. Oh dear, that's a rebuff, if ever I heard one. Well, Eisenman had been reading the news, and one article that had come out at the time said that there was a new technology that would make Theranos obsolete. This is the second Google alert I have received that claims Theranos could become obsolete, he wrote to Balwani, and Balwani responded, I think these emails are beyond ridiculous, and Holmes later accused Eisenman of harassing Lucas. On Tuesday there was a very interesting discussion in court before the jury arrived. Holmes' lawyers had presented their list of witnesses in court filings last Thursday. Lance Wade said, We're not saying we're presenting a defence case by giving them a list of witnesses. Now, what he is saying here is that there is a potential strategy that the defence may not call anyone at all and simply make their closing argument and then turn the case over to the jury. Now, being very honest, I never saw that coming. If it does happen, then the whole trial is likely to wrap up within a couple of weeks. I do have some thoughts on how this may benefit the defence as a strategy, but I'll leave them out of this video for now until I've had a little while to digest things further. Denise Yam. We had Denise again, and as a reminder, she was the controller for the company, and she was asked about a $1.1 million payment to Horizon Media. So remember, this was one of the wire fraud payments, not receipts from investors in the indictment. The payment was for advertising the wellness centres, and essentially the prosecution were asking Denise to confirm that approvals were given by Holmes and Balwani in 2015. Lance Wade for the defence asked if Yam knew if any of the ads actually ran. She didn't. I'm not quite sure what line the defence are taking here. Did the ads run? Didn't they? How would it benefit the defence either way? Well, I'll just leave those as open questions. Brian Grossman. Brian was an investor who worked for PFM, who we heard about earlier in the trial, and PFM invested just over $96 million in Theranos, part of which is included in the indictment. You can probably now guess how the line of questioning went and the information that he was asked to explain. Let's just run through these as we have with other investors, and you'll see a familiar pattern emerge. There really were no limitations to the technology he had thought after visiting Theranos. He was told that Theranos had $200 million in revenues, primarily from defence, which we obviously now know is not true. Holmes did the talking, and Balwani never disagreed. Theranos machines were more accurate, had less variability. They were emphatic that this was the entire laboratory shrunk down into a box, he said. They were faster. They were being used by Big Pharma in clinical trials. Now this he said he was very impressed by, as it implied, in his words, enormous confidence in Theranos. Along with the revenues, obviously he was told that Theranos worked with the military. Theranos could do every test on the Quest and LabCorp menus. Now these are two competing labs, and this was a very big statement, said Grossman. Oh, and forecast revenues. 1.6 billion for 2015, he was told. One key element in the interaction with Theranos was that he said he was never told that Theranos used third-party machines to run most of their tests. Part of the difference we have with Brian Grossman versus some of the other investors we've heard is that he knows the biotechnology sector backwards. He'd sent Theranos a very lengthy email with questions in various categories that he wanted answers to, and these included the tech accuracy, speed, the Walgreens partnership, Boots Alliance, regulatory, financial data, etc., etc. Oh dear, Grossman went to have a finger prick test at a Walgreens pharmacy. Oh dear, he had a venous draw, not a finger prick. Oh dear, it took much longer than the 4 hours to get his results. Now, from all that we've heard, we're not surprised at this, but Grossman was, clearly, and at the time he questioned this with Balwani. He told me one of the tests my physician had ordered was a highly unusual test. We then had the defence questioning. Well, the blood test obviously struck a chord with the defence as they went straight into this piece. A venous draw shouldn't have been a surprise. It wasn't a secret that Theranos sometimes did this. A press release was looked at in court that did support this assertion, and there was some tit for tat over what the actual meaning of the words in the press release was, but Grossman said even then that it would have been concerning to him to learn that Theranos was using the microsamples on traditional machines. Did he ever ask this of Theranos? The defence put to Grossman. I don't recall, he said. We then had the defence turn to cross-examine Grossman. We had a very detailed review of the due diligence process that Grossman went through. Email after email after email was reviewed with him. As part of this process, Grossman had asked a certain Dr. Robodzi to look into Theranos. Oh dear, Robodzi went to have a finger prick test at a Walgreens pharmacy. Oh dear, he had a venous draw, not a finger prick. Now, Balwani said to both Robodzi and Grossman that this happens only with 1% of patients. Now, I understand how probability works, and if both of them had had independent tests, then the odds of both having a venous draw would be 1% times 1%. In other words, if 1% is correct, then there was a 1 in 10,000 chance that both would have had the venous draw instead of a finger prick. Something isn't right with Balwani's answer, I think. Well, we actually know now that around 40%, not 1% of tests, were being done via venous draw. Okay, so the defence have shown here that a lot of work was done by PFM, and they even did their own internal forecasts as a sanity check on Theranos' own projections. The defence cross-examination was actually around 6 hours, and Judge De Villa expressed annoyance with the defence in respect of this. This could play havoc with our trial schedule, he said. There was one final question from the prosecution, to which Grossman replied, I did not factor in that Theranos was not being truthful as a potential risk of investment. Erin Tompkins. Erin is a former patient of Theranos who had used Theranos as she was uninsured and the costs would be cheaper than going elsewhere. After a test in 2015, the results came back. She was HIV positive. She said she was very emotional about this at the time and had had an additional test at a women's clinic which showed up as negative. Several tests in the years since then have also been shown as negative. This, to me, is the human side of the Theranos debacle. Real people in real time having their lives turned upside down through faulty and incorrect testing. Even today, Erin was quite emotional as she recounted this in the witness box, now over 6 years later. A very short cross-examination by the defence, and I don't think they'd gain anything by keeping Erin in front of the jury for much longer. We'd learned from them that Erin did get a refund. Oh, but that was about 2 years later. Mark Burns. Mark was an Arizona doctor and he took the stand on Thursday to talk about lab results he'd received from Theranos in respect of his patient Mel Ellsworth. Now, Mel had received a prostate-specific antigen test with a result of 26.1. Now, anything over 4 is a concern, but it is how the values change over time that is important. They ran another test a few days later. The result was 1.71. Yet another test gave a result of 22.8. And a fourth test gave a result of 0.95. Burns said that he thought 2 of the results were errors and discussed the results with Theranos. Essentially what we heard is that there were a whole load of internal emails on the issue, and the key to this is that the entire email chain on how to respond to Burns was forwarded to Holmes. The defence established that prior to this test he had had no issues with Theranos tests. Roger Parloff. Roger is an ex-lawyer who after 5 years of law became a journalist. He worked for Fortune and was responsible for the famous Fortune article, "This CEO is out for blood." He said that it was common for him to record his interviews, which he did for the Fortune article. Now, he took a finger prick test and this went exactly as Theranos were promoting. However, in his case it wasn't just a random drop-in, as some of the investors we've previously heard did. It was orchestrated by Theranos. All seemed good from his perspective. In respect of the research he did for the article and on interviewing Holmes, one exchange with Holmes went as follows. When I looked at Quest, they have many different kinds of chemistry going on. They do about 600 types of tests in this regional lab, many kinds of samples, preparing slides amongst other things. Now does your platform replace all of those? We can do all of those tests. We can provide data back to clinicians for all those same tests. Parloff said Holmes never mentioned anything about modified third-party machines. Parloff said that Holmes told him Theranos technology had been used by the military. It wasn't, but he wasn't allowed to publish that fact. We saw the now infamous Pfizer report. Holmes never told Parloff that it wasn't prepared by Pfizer. We saw the now infamous Schering-Plough report. Holmes never told Parloff that this wasn't prepared by Schering-Plough. In one recording, we heard Holmes say to Parloff in respect of tests not on the list of 200 tests on the Theranos website, "We can handle it." After the Wall Street Journal article came out, Parloff questioned Holmes again. Parloff said that Holmes admitted that Theranos could only do 50 or 60 or 70 tests, and not the 1,000 plus she claimed in her interview for the Fortune piece. Now, even this was an extreme exaggeration. We know that they only did around 12 tests on their machines. We then had Klein for the defence. Parloff said that there were certain questions he would not answer due to journalistic privilege, and that was a wrap for the day. Courtroom updates. Okay, so on Friday morning there were a couple of pre-witness preliminaries. We heard an interesting statistic. Apparently the prosecution had questioned witnesses for 53 hours versus the 65 hours of questions from the defence. The point that Jeffrey Schenck, attorney for the prosecution, was making was that the defence arguments have already begun. There were arguments between the prosecution and defence as to whether the testimony of Fabrizio Bonanni should be included as a defence witness. He was a board member who joined in 2016, and essentially his role was to try and fix the issues that Theranos had been having, and was recruited by Holmes. The prosecution argued that he joined after the fraud that they have indicted Holmes and Balwani for, and this is therefore irrelevant to the trial. If you'll recall, a witness, BB, a Theranos patient, was excluded from testifying because prosecutors did not include his blood tests in a list of tests they would be discussing at trial. The defence made the argument a couple of weeks ago that this was not their fault and the prosecution should take responsibility. Well, they did, and in a win for the defence, the prosecution dropped the charge in the indictment. This is the one you see here, and the number of counts is now at 11. And that is it. With Parloff, the government rests its case. Phew, quite a saga so far. We'll find out what the defence does in respect of its witnesses in due course. As usual, we'll boil the whole week down in court to the bare essentials. Oh, and please don't forget to like this video, if you do, subscribe and then hit the notification button so that you don't miss out on future trial updates and other videos when they are published. Week 12 in a nutshell. Alan Eisenman. Alan was an early investor in Theranos with 1.1 million investment in total. The defence cross-examined him this week, and he said he didn't get the information he'd expected from Holmes and Balwani. We had emails from Balwani showing some responses, and he had had the opportunity to exit with a $25 million profit, but turned the offer down. Denise Yam. She was the controller for Theranos, and this was her second appearance in court, and she was asked about a 1.1 million payment to Horizon Media. And now this was for advertising, and we heard that Holmes and Balwani approved it, and she didn't know if the specific ads actually ran or not. Brian Grossman. Brian was an investor with PFM who had invested $96 million in Theranos. He was a biotechnology industry expert and very impressed with Theranos based on his discussions with Balwani and Holmes. He was told about military contracts, which we know wasn't true. He was told the tech was fantastic. He had the Venus test, not the fingerprint test, on a drop-in. The defence grilled him significantly on his due diligence and email correspondence, and this at least was significant. Erin Tompkins. Erin was a patient of Theranos and used them because they were cheaper. She tested positive for HIV. Now this was an incorrect test, and she went to alternatives for subsequent tests, showing her not to be positive for HIV, and she had had a very emotional experience at the time. Mark Burns. Mark was a doctor whose patient used Theranos tests. Now a lab result received in respect of his patient, a prostate antigen test, was provided to him. There were varied results, 26, 2, 23, 1, these were all over the place, and he'd had no issues with Theranos prior to this. And finally, Roger Parloff. He was the journalist responsible for the Fortune article, and the article said over 1,000 tests could be done on Theranos machines based on Holmes' interviews. The Sharing Plough and Pfizer documents were presented to him, and we now know that these are false. After the Wall Street Journal articles, Holmes told him that 50, 60, 70 tests could be done, not the 1,000, and we now know that they could only do 12. So that's it. Don't forget that these were all prosecution witnesses who finished their case on Friday.